That first slide is actually a picture of downtown Columbus, and you can see on the left-hand side the AEP building there. And a lot of the smart city technologies that we're doing and implementing and testing are really trying to give access to very new and exciting electrification opportunities, mobility opportunities, and smart building opportunities to all segments of our society. And if I take a minute to think about the whole journey of electrification throughout the world, it's about universal access. And I'll hit on that point as we go through this presentation. Now, on the first slide, I really want to sort of explain the strategic intent behind where we are, where we find ourselves, and where we believe the grid is going. And some of it is driven by technology, but a lot of it is driven by changing preferences of our customers, changing societal attitudes, and changing desires of the people who make policy and regulation. But technology is driving the decentralization, and many of you probably have a smartphone, and you've seen the number of disruptions that the internet with shopping and smartphones as a platform, whether it be things like Uber or it'll be things like Airbnb, they've been completely disrupted by a digitalized, decentralized environment. And those exact same forces apply to the electric grid. The electric grid, when it first started, was a more decentralized model. But then there was the issue about getting fuel to power plants, and it made sense to centralize those power plants far away from where people lived and build long transmission lines to load centers. But the technology has evolved so much in the last century, and especially in the last 10 to 20 years, that is now you can build efficient, reliable, affordable, sustainable generation sources close to where you have load and have it much more intelligent, have lots of devices. And again, you see this in lots of things, cameras, in devices in your house, in thermostats, in appliances. All of them are becoming intelligent and digital. And they can all participate in the grid. They can talk to the grid, they can communicate with the grid and be controlled with the grid. And we see our customers, whether they're houses or commercial premises or buildings, all becoming smarter. And while the word smart is overused in the context of either a smart city or a smart grid, it really means you're putting digital technology at the edge of the grid. And you're allowing those digital components to talk to each other, to make local decisions, to also communicate back and provide a rich array of data that allows you to optimize for the conditions of the grid. So rather than build new, bigger assets, you can use the assets you have more optimally. You can integrate these different types of resources and have a more optimized environment. And digitalization, it applies to all parts of our lives, and especially coming into the energy products and services area, where you'll have an app that you'll be able to control. For some people who like a greater level of detail, they'll be able to dive deeper. For some people who have set it and forget it, they can set their home or premise based on comfort or cost. And then the whole electrification of transportation. I always say, you know, an iPhone is really a computer that happens to make phone calls, and an electric vehicle is really a computer on wheels. And they're changing the way we look at it, the way we look at these products. And lastly, but not leastly, is decarbonization. I think the climate threat and risk are real, and all our customers across all segments, residential, commercial, and industrial, are looking at decarbonizing their own supply, decarbonizing the supply chain that supplies to them, looking for cleaner, greener options. And some of it is driven by environmental and climate concerns. Some of it is driven by just pure financial considerations. The costs of renewable energy and storage have come down dramatically, and they're a viable option in many places. So these three, and people call this the 3Ds, decentralization, digitalization, decarbonization, they are driving factors driven by technology, driven by our customers, driven by regulatory and policy considerations that are moving us towards the smart and I use the term smart community because I didn't want anyone to be left out in the arena of making their the place that they live smart. You don't have to be in a very big city or a small city. And frankly, one of the reasons why Columbus won, because out of the finalists, was it represents any city in the United States. If you can make it work here, there's nothing unique that you can't make it work in any city in the United States. And I would suggest in many, many cities across the world, the same learnings that we're having, the same experiments and pilots that we're doing could work everywhere. So moving on to the next slide, and I've talked about this a bit before, this disruption is happening. The technology is getting much smarter. And I like this slide because it looks, if you look at this, the taxi cabs were very much, the taxi cabs in New York are very much like a regulated utility. They have a whole bunch of regulation that makes it kind of hard to get into that space. You need to own a lot of assets. You need to follow a lot of rules. The barrier to entry is really high. But Uber, which is a software company based in San Francisco and didn't own any cars or any drivers, didn't follow any regulatory model at that time, was able to come in and disrupt the taxi industry across most of the United States. And a very similar story is true with Airbnb and Hilton. And we see, and the hotel chains, and we see, of course, the analogies don't hold 100% with the electric grid. You still need wires. You still need to transport electrons from one point to the other. But you don't have to do it. If you had a blank sheet of paper today, you would build the grid very differently than it was built in the past. It would be more resilient and more decentralized. That way you wouldn't have large-scale outages when one or two major transmission lines went down. You wouldn't be so dependent on a few power plants being operating. You'd have a much more resilient, from a cybersecurity, a physical threat, and a weather threat perspective. And you look at developing countries across the world, they sort of bypassed the whole let's put lots of copper lines in for telephones and went straight to cell phones because it didn't make sense going through the transition from an old model to a new model when you could just leapfrog through the new model. And a lot of island nations, a lot of island communities are thinking, do I need to do it the way it was designed before, or can I build the electrical grid in a more modern way? And we see a lot of those modern techniques being implemented in different areas of the grid, and I'll talk about them as we go further down. So if you ask people what the definition of a smart city is, they will give you a variety of answers, and there is no right answer here. And the reason I say that is I use this as my framework to define what a smart community is. And it'll evolve over time. Communities being smart, and why Columbus was front and center in the smart city win is our mayor said we want to really solve the first mile and last mile problem for our underserved, lower income demographic. These are people who are struggling to get by, probably don't own their own car, they have to take public transportation. And the city of Columbus has a reasonable public transportation infrastructure. But from your house to get to the first point of where you take a public transport option is usually a mile, maybe a mile, a little over a kilometer is probably the right distance. And then where it drops you off to where you have to go to childcare, or you have to go to work, or you have to go to school, is another mile or so. So that's what he refers to as a first mile, last mile problem. And getting to either your school or your place of work or daycare or a hospital for a medical appointment, it's a big deal for for all those people in that demographic, in that societal section. And they're not an insignificant part of the city. So how can we use technologies to provide them an answer to that first mile, last mile problem? Sometimes it may be as simple as give them all the data that they need to do something we call a multimodal journey. Could I take a bicycle? Could I take a scooter? Could I walk a bit? Could I take a bus? Could I take a train? Could I share a cab or an Uber? And then eventually get. And right now that's difficult to do, but could we put it all together in one way, present the data and the options so that someone could stitch together a multimodal ride to get from one point to another point to do what they need to do productively for that day? Could we get self-driving vehicles? We believe the future of transportation is electric. We believe that the future of transportation is also autonomous and shared. So if you look at transportation being electric, autonomous, and shared, the shared vehicles I talked about, it gives you the option to, don't have the full cost of the ride, but still have access to it. The autonomous option, it can really solve the last mile issue for people going to large places of work, like a big industrial park, an airport, a shipyard, or where the public transport drops you. Maybe then you can have some autonomous shuttles, which we're testing in Columbus, Ohio, and most people say, well, that's far away, but autonomous vehicles for short predefined routes are already available and working. And every time you take a train in an airport to go from Terminal 1 to Terminal 2, you're really in an autonomous train. Same concept, same logic on a road, in a predefined path. You could use that, and then that would solve a lot of the last mile problems. Electric bikes and electric scooters could solve a lot of the first mile problems. How do you provide them in a way that allows people to know where they are, allows people to use them, allows people to have access to them? So the whole electric vehicles, last mile, if you look at the center of my chart, you have the last mile transport issue, you have electric vehicles, you have communication, tell me where these modes of transport are. Transportation is mobility and transport. The smart community, smart cities concept is to provide all citizens a better quality of life, a better ability to support themselves, or a better ability to give their children and their family the best that they can. And transportation plays a huge part in how good the quality of their life is, how successful they'll be at school and education, how successful they'll be at keeping and thriving at a job. And then there's a lot of freight and transport. We spend, and every country is different, but a lot of our freight in the United States is transported across roads. It comes in via ships, gets unloaded in harbors, then taken to major centers by train, but the trains don't go everywhere, and goods are transported on the road with the big tractor trailers here. Can we do that more efficiently? Can we do platooning? Can we have autonomous tractor trailers? So you have one leading and then a few following using technology. The same thing is true, and I always say the utility is not the only part of a smart city or a smart community, but it's an integral part of a smart city. And I would say that's true both of the electric utility, but I would even say water, gas, and telecom. All these utilities have to be at a level of reliability and operability that allows smart technologies to sit on top of them. And we're looking at, again, a more resilient grid will have the ability to withstand severe weather events. So while climate is really important, the risk already is increasing. How do you allow the electrical system to be more resilient in the face of a changing weather circumstance? And you can do that by having microgrids. And you can have energy storage. Again, you can do a lot of things on the utility side to allow for reliable, robust infrastructure. And if you want a lot of electric vehicles, you have to have charging infrastructure. You have to have both public charging infrastructure, workplace charging infrastructure, and then charging infrastructure to your house. And the last area here is urban design. And buildings are a huge source, a huge user of energy. And today, buildings are not very smart. I mean, some buildings have some light sensors. Mostly, people turn on all the lights and all the heating and cooling at some point in the morning, and it stays on the whole day and shuts down at some point in the night. But not every floor, not every room is occupied. You have sensors and temperature sensors and occupancy sensors and lighting sensors, using the ambient outside light, using the internal light. How could you use sensors and the data that you have and occupancy to optimize given the weather conditions? And many of us have been in buildings where on a hot day, it's way too hot inside the building. On a cold day, it's way too cold. And sometimes it's in the middle, and it's difficult to get it right. But there's lots of technology that allows you to get that in. How can you design buildings? What materials can you use? How can you handle emergencies? How can you have your building management system and the sensors you have in the building much smarter, so that they not only optimize the building, but they talk back to the electric grid and communicate with the grid so that they're optimized in that context. So this is the model I use. There are many models out there. There are many definitions out there, and I'm sure this will, but I always find it helpful to have a model, and these three circles, and right at the center is a community. And that could be a town, it could be a village, it could be a city, it could be a mega city. But all of them can use parts or all of these technologies. And we're trying several of these, and I will talk about what we are doing in the city of Columbus as it relates to this definition as we go through the presentation. So this is the stated goals of the Smart City Columbus initiative. And it's a 4-year initiative. And when I set the stage earlier in the presentation of strategically where do we think the grid is going, it's going to be decentralized, it's going to be digitalized, and it's going to be decarbonized. And you look at the Smart City goals, they very much connect together. They align with what we've done. I should not take credit. It really was driven in the beginning by our CEO, and we sort of said, taken on that mantle and looked for many different ways that the utility can play an important part in improving people's lives. But the first goal is drive economic growth. You know, a lot of these things are new. They have the potential to bring new jobs to the area. They have the potential to drive innovation in the area. The cars are going to be smarter. They're going to talk to roads. Roads are going to talk to traffic signals. Traffic signals are going to talk back to cars. People are going to talk machines, and machines are going to communicate. The example I took with buildings and sensors and people, you're going to have, and this is a long-winded description of what is generally referred to as the industrial Internet of Things. So as you have more companies play in that, maybe some of those companies will choose to come to the city of Columbus to set up a site to foster that development. And for people outside of the United States, Columbus is kind of logistically in the center of a very large population density that it acts like a logistics hub. So we have a lot of companies ship things to Columbus, and then from Columbus they're trucked out to many, many different population centers. And we have a huge area that does that. And could we work with them? Could we work with builders and developers? Retrofitting buildings is one opportunity, but also new buildings. Can they be built in with these sensors, with electric charging capabilities, so that you have it already baked in? And we've been talking not only to the city of Columbus, but many cities surrounding the city of Columbus to start building parking structures built in with electric vehicle charging infrastructure already, much, much cheaper than doing it after the fact. Think about what kind of workforce do you need as the world gets more digitalized. Do more. We work with the universities, and we call it the triple helix, where we have public agencies like the City of Columbus, city departments, city transport. We have private companies like American Electric Power, like many of the companies placed in Central Ohio, like Honda and Nationwide Insurance. And then we have great research institutions like Battelle and Ohio State University. And all three come together to partner to build smart city implementation, smart city experiments, smart city pilots. And, you know, I usually say, if you remember nothing from this presentation, it's really about two things. It's about partnerships and pilots. Because there are many options and there are many problems that each area, each city, each community would like to solve. And each community needs to prioritize the areas they want to solve. And then let's see, okay, for people, how do I solve the most pressing problem for my citizens with the technology that are available? And the world is moving this way. I mean, it's inevitable and inexorable. The second, and I think the most important from a utility standpoint, is we want to improve the quality of people's lives. Can we give them access? Can we solve the mobility challenges? Can we give people more alternatives and options to get from point A to B? Can we do it in a way that doesn't just add more stress to the roads, lengthen commutes and time to get to places? And people want to live in a place that it's easy to get to work and easy to get back home. How can we do that with the Smart City Columbus goals? The third area is foster sustainability. And that's as we electrify transportation, we reduce, excuse me, we reduce the amount of greenhouse gases because an electric vehicle will produce less CO2 than, no matter how it's charged, than an equivalent gasoline car or internal combustion engine. We also think, and we don't see it as much in Columbus, but we hear about it a lot in the bigger US cities, that younger people are no longer buying cars. They don't want the hassle of insurance, of parking, of the high cost. They just want to use shared transport, whether it'll be Uber or Lyft or one of those transport apps. And that helps with utilization and also alleviates the congestion on the roads. And lots of cities across the world are also looking at, how do I make my city, how do I put congestion prices, how do I prevent lots of city cars from coming into the city center, how do I make my city less vehicle dependent, more pedestrian friendly. And a lot of the electric mobility technologies can help you do that, whether they're electric bicycles or electric scooters, that you can still get from point A to point B in a reasonable time, but you don't have to use a car to do that. And all this requires good, reliable telecommunications and electric infrastructure. And that's where the utility can do, they can do all the we call it make ready, which is get that site or that premise, that customer location or public location ready for electric bikes, electric vehicles, electric scooters, anything electric that needs to be charged periodically during the day. So we think we can do that. We also think there's a safety aspect. As vehicles and the roads and bridges and infrastructure become more intelligent, they will prevent, and we have a lot of pedestrian accidents and deaths in the United States that could be prevented if vehicles were smart enough to recognize as a pedestrian and automatically stop, eliminate human errors, whether it's due to just oversight, inattention, impaired driving. You can do much more of that if you use technology. Okay, so moving on to the next slide. This is what so AEP is comprised of 7 operating companies. The one operating company that is part of the Smart City Columbus is AEP Ohio. And this just shows the things we asked for and we got. And we got a Smart City Rider. We're doing smart lighting and smart lighting pilot with street lights. We're doing research and development. We're electrifying company fleets. We're completing an installation of AMI meters. We've got approval, actually, it says pending, but we've got that approval to do 300 level 2 public charges and a phenomenal number of DC fast chargers. We're going to do it along highway corridors. And we're doing, at the moment, we're doing one microgrid in the public interest that'll have renewable energy and battery storage. There's a building in Columbus, Ohio that's managed by a government agency that we're putting in microgrid capability. So in the event of a weather or an extended outage, this facility will continue to have power. And at the bottom, you can see our in-kind to the smart city, but all the work that we're doing is about $185 million in in-kind programs, and we're also putting in $700,000 for R&D. And this all adds up to a big bucket that the city of Columbus is tracking in both in-kind and actual contributions to, again, foster that public-private partnership and lots of partnerships and pilots. So this shows you that triple helix I talked about, and that logo is a smart city logo in the middle. It has the private sector, it has the public sector, and it has, and this partnership, I can't overstate how new, unique, important, and complex this is. These sectors typically don't work together. The model of engagement, the model of collaboration is complex. Sharing information, protecting IP is complex. But to make the city smart, to change the way we provide services, all these people have to come together. We're learning a lot more about how the public sector and the public sector operates. They're learning more about what drives and how we prioritize our asset investment and deployment. And academia have, and I get heartened every time I visit universities and talk to students on their insightfulness and innovation on solving the big problems we have in the future. And we're blessed, I think, in Central Ohio to have Battelle, that's a very, very large research organization, the Ohio State University, which is, I think, among the largest public universities in the United States, working with us, and many city organizations, and many private sector organizations, and you can see Honda, the limited brands nationwide, and we have the Vulcan, Paul Allen Company is one of the contributors to the Smart City Award. But these partnerships, while they're complicated and they haven't been done, they're critically important to do the pilots. Otherwise, you'll do limited pilots that will have limited reach. And to really affect the lives of the citizens and inhabitants of the community, you need that partnership. Because I'll give you a very small example. Building electric vehicle charging infrastructure requires you to go through a lot of zoning, and the zoning rules are run by the city. And the city, with all good intentions, has lots and lots of rules and issues and regulations related to where could you put an electric vehicle, how should it be sited, where you can put a battery, what are the rules around it, and some of them are not very well defined because these are new technologies. But working together, can we build? We want a good rule set, but can we build a streamlined process where once you go to a dealership to buy an electric vehicle, it's very quick for you to then get your house or your garage outfitted with an electric vehicle charging plug point so that you're ready to go and you don't have that barrier that stops you from buying what is an excellent vehicle to transport yourself with, a purely battery electric operated vehicle. So this partnership part is really important. And then the pilot part, I would say, is many of these things, you're going to have to start small. The technology, while it shows great promise, is at a lower level of maturity. The autonomous vans that we're using, they're good, but they're good for short distances, and they go at relatively slow speeds. So they can be used in certain circumstances. I'm sure, like every technology, they'll get better over time. But right now, you sort of have to start small, try, learn from the pilot. Some pilots will be successful, some pilots will not be successful. But the ones that are not successful, learn from them, watch and scout and learn from the environment and see when it might be ready for deployment. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And the ones that are successful, figure out smart ways to then scale up, deploy it more widely. And while we're going to have a lot of sensors and Internet of Things devices, that's going to give a lot of data. And the data that we're going to get is going to be rich and powerful. And it will help hone in the services that we provide, the products we provide, because you have great insight into how the services are being used with the data that you're collecting, so you can continuously learn from the data and make the offering better. Okay, and on the next slide, I just wanted to highlight, because many people think plugging in an electric vehicle, that's just a plug and I plug it in. How complicated can that be? And I always say, what you see on the outlet is the top of the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot of ice underneath there that's very important that you don't see, that helps with that charging infrastructure. There's a whole grid, traditional grid utility, that infrastructure that has to, if the grid's strong at that point, there's no issue. Build it, charge it, no problem. But many times where you want to put charging infrastructure, the grid hasn't been built for that kind of load and has to be. So it could be a communication between the utility and the implementer of charging infrastructure to just say, if you do it on that side, it'll be much cheaper than if you do it on this side of your premise, because the distribution infrastructure is much more robust here, whereas it's not on that side. The location where you put these charging infrastructures is important. There's a whole make ready, and I talked about this a little earlier, which is retrofitting is going to be significantly more expensive than, and depending on where you want to put it, than if you did it in a new build. So if you're building new infrastructure and you believe the future, like I do, the future of transportation is electric, build some level of boring and trenching and conductors in your garage facilities. If you're building public garages or public vehicle infrastructure, so that you can allow for it. You don't have to put charging everywhere, but at least put the basic conductor trenches in place. And then there's a whole cloud processing. There's a whole data so that I recognize who you are. I recognize what price I should charge you. It could be free. Many times we do initial charging, recharging. Many cities have done this to encourage the adoption of electric vehicles. For 2 years, your charging will be free, and then you'll pay a certain amount. We want to know what's going on with your car. We want to give you feedback saying, hey, if you need to charge, depending on your journey and how much battery life you have left, here's where your next charging station is. So there's a lot more interactiveness with a battery vehicle than there is with an internal combustion engine vehicle. And we also think, some people say people will use a battery electric vehicle the same way they use an internal combustion engine. And we think, no, they won't. An internal combustion engine, once a week you go, you fill up your gas, and you go. Here I think we'll be doing shorter charging, but more often. Whenever we have an opportunity, we will charge it, but we won't charge it completely. And you see that behavior if you ever go to an airport and you see everybody with their cell phones running to plug it in, even though they probably have a lot of power in their cell phone. That's just I find it instructive on human behavior. You always want to keep that battery topped up, even though you might not need it that long. We don't do that with a gasoline car. We wait till it goes to empty and then we fill it up. But we think the behavior will be different with electric vehicles. And so in this one, there are many models of interaction between the electric company and the customer, and this just shows the many different models. And I'm not here, I'm just exposing the different models. In the United States, all of these have been deployed at different locations. So they have advantages and disadvantages. You can have the customer own most of it with the service provided by the electric company on the first one. You can have the electric company own all of it. What we say is, at least for areas that don't have very rich people or a high-income demographic, the market probably won't come and serve those customers, especially if you live in shared apartments or lower-income housing. And you don't want that segment of the population to be denied the opportunity to own an electric vehicle of any sort, whether it's a very small personal car, whether it's an electric bicycle, an electric scooter, whether it's a shared car, whether it's a minivan. And so you want to make sure that however you design electric vehicle supply equipment infrastructure, you serve all segments of the population. And that's part of what we filed for, and we're saying we're going to give out rebates, but we're going to give it across all demographic sections, across all types of neighborhoods, so that we don't intend to own it everywhere, but we want to foster the adoption of electric vehicles and give every citizen in our city and every customer that we have the option, if they so desire, to move to an electric vehicle. And I think this is one of my last slides. I've got one on batteries. We talked about electric vehicles. We've been in the forefront of battery installation. We really think we have a saying at AEP, batteries beget batteries. As you get more and more electric vehicles and you want to charge them, maybe batteries could be used to help with fast charging, rather than build up the grid so that you have to deal with new peaks. You have batteries that can help you with that and help with the charging infrastructure and smoothing out the loads so that you have a more predictable load profile. We've had a lot of experience with batteries in AEP, and we look forward to planning to deploying, and using more batteries. The title here says NAS, and NAS actually stands for sodium sulfur. It's a type of chemistry that we've used in the past. Probably in this time and age, we'll probably continue to use lithium-ion batteries. They're cheaper, and their cost is being driven down really by the car manufacturers that are deploying a lot of cars in the environment using lithium-ion batteries. And the last slide I have is a microgrid and shared capital model. Microgrids are particularly interesting. When I go and present about microgrids to to people in the country. I always ask, who like a microgrid? Everyone will put up their hand because they love the idea of a much more resilient, reliable source of power for their facility or residence. But then I ask who will pay for a microgrid, and many hands go down. That's the conundrum we have. How do we share capital between the customer and the utility for something that benefits mostly one customer? And we're looking at lots of retailers, big box retailers in the United States saying, when you do have an outage, it does cost you a lot. If you do have a microgrid, you could have much better reliability and resiliency. You will have to pay a little more, but maybe we will subsidize that cost because we will use those assets for other purposes while you're not using them when you're in a normal mode of operation. We're looking at putting distributed generation, energy storage, and software and communications to make that work. Again, the piloting is important. The partnership with the customer is important. The partnership with the regulatory organization to build a construct to allow this to happen is important. It's very exciting. The technologies are important, but not the only component in this whole smart community rollout. And I'll just end by saying the whole part of building a smart community is deconstructing and building these partnerships, these public, private, and academic partnerships, partnerships with customers, partnerships with suppliers, partnerships with technology providers, and also piloting, trying things. And piloting, while partnerships is new, it's at least understood. Piloting is, cities and utilities are actually not used to piloting. They're used to doing normal procurement processes, which is, I know the answer, give me something that fits this, and then you take all risk and deploy it at scale. Piloting is, I don't know the answer, we'll share in the risk, we'll deploy a small pilot, we'll learn from that, and then we'll both move together. And there's cultural and communication and change management aspects associated with both of those that I think are as significant learnings for us as the technology has been. With that, I will turn it back, I think, to...
Yes, thank you so much, Ram, for that very interesting presentation. So we will start now with the question and answer period, which will go for about 15 minutes. So if you have any questions for Ram, please type them in the question and answer box on the right-hand side of your screen, and we will start taking questions as they come in. So we'll give you a minute right now so that you can begin typing your questions. Please go ahead. Okay, we actually have a first question that's come in from David. He asks, what would be a feasible method for measuring the urban heat island effect? And I would add, if that's something that you considered in your model when you're working with your Smart City Columbus team.
So that's a great question. We've talked about it. We haven't yet designed any tools or methods to measure it. But we have talked about it. We have talked about methods of mitigation. It's a great question, and I would just say we're in the process of researching it.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Please don't hesitate to type your questions into the question and answer box. So we will wait for you all the participants to do so. Okay, we have a second question coming from Audrey. They ask, which kind of economic model can match with the microgrid where the consumer is also a producer?
And that's a great question. That's the one we are actively working on. And we actually have a lot of models related to microgrids. And one of the financial streams is the microgrid host can also produce energy that will offset some of their energy usage, or maybe even export it back to the grid. And we call that a net metered customer. And we're working through that too. And there are places where the site could take in energy, be an energy sink. They could provide energy, be an energy source. One of the dilemmas, if you will, that we face in our service territory, which is different than the coasts of the United States, is our retail price of electricity is relatively low in our service territory. It's about 11 cents a kilowatt hour. And it makes it a little bit more challenging for energy to be a big part of the equation here. But we look at energy, and we look at capacity, and we look at resiliency. And we say we can value energy, we can value capacity. They're actually pretty easy and straightforward to value. Resiliency is much harder to value because we don't have a standard way of measuring resiliency and then assigning it a value, and it's very, very dependent on the host. But on the question related to energy, we absolutely use either being an importer when we need it to be, or an exporter when there's surplus and we need that excess energy, and then bilateral settlement between the grid operator, which would be us, and the customer to offset operating costs of the microgrid.
That's perfect. Thank you. We have a question from Marina. They ask, how long do you think this transformation will take for smart electrification?
That's another great question. And, you know, I'm many times asked to put on my futuristic hat and predict things like that. And even within our own company, you'll have a very wide range of predictions. Let me take one example, electric vehicles. Right now, we have maybe 1 million electric vehicles in the United States, which is not very many. But I believe that we will start to, fleets at least in this country, will start to electrify rapidly. I believe from 5 years from now, we'll have we won't go to 100% electric, but it'll be a significant enough amount of electric vehicles, 20% electric vehicles, that will change the way people travel, the way people charge. And I would say within 5 to 10 years, I expect that transition to be mostly done on at least on the fleet and public vehicles, buses, school buses, transportation for the public. Again, that's my feeling. There are people at AEP that feel it'll go much slower. There are people who feel it'll go a little slower. I'm probably on the more bullish side of it. But again, I'm based in the Midwest of the United States. If you go to the West Coast, they're on both renewables and on electric vehicles and storage, and they have policy driving them. But they're way further ahead than some of the numbers I've just described. Hopefully that answers your question.
That's perfect. Thank you. We have another question here from Remy, who asks if you could elaborate a little bit more on how this pilot project is going to minimize carbon content in the atmosphere.
So on one of my slides, I said we've got a lot of push for renewable energy. So we're going to do much more renewable energy, which will displace carbon-producing sources. And there are lots of studies that show when you electrify transportation, and let me take a step back. If you look at carbon dioxide production, and I may not get the numbers exactly right, but it's like 30% is power generation, 30% approximately is transportation, and the rest is a combination of industrial processes and heating. So if you start to electrify transportation, an electric vehicle per mile traveled, no matter how it's powered, whether it's powered by fossil or not, it still is lower carbon intensity than if it wasn't. So as you electrify, you automatically start to reduce your carbon dioxide. And we actually have numbers to say, if we have this adoption of carbon dioxide, given the AEP Ohio generation mix, this is your carbon dioxide reduction. The same thing is true of what I said about buildings. If buildings are a big user of energy, if their energy usage starts to go down, as you go down by building, you can do calculations and measurements that show the carbon dioxide reduction. Again, I think all this is publicly available on the City of Columbus website, but we have models that sort of say, at this level of adoption, this is the carbon reduction for electric transportation. At this level of renewable displacement of fossil generation, this is the carbon dioxide. At this level of building automation, building intelligence, this is the level of carbon dioxide reduction. One of the requirements of the Smart City Grant, because it was funded by the Paul Allen, the Vulcan Foundation, is to prove and show carbon dioxide reduction with smart city technologies.
That's great. Thank you so much. We have a question here from Mustafa, who says, building smart cities is the way to go, and building synergies with other sectors, especially financial institutions, is crucial. But how can we encourage banks and other financial institutions for funding, since the financial outlay is huge to achieve smart city goals?
That's a good question, and it's probably, it'll be hard for me to say in which country that would be the country that the speaker's from, but in the United States, generally financial institutions are very favorably disposed to smart city technologies because they have a lot of publicly proclaimed policy leaders and regulatory leaders say we fully support smart cities. Every city is, in a funny way, it's kind of like a public competition where cities are competing against other cities to say who builds a better, smarter city. And when you get a city behind it, when you get a public agency behind it, generally in the United States, there's not a funding issue because banks know cities are good for it, right? They've got the whole, especially if a city is doing well, they've got access to public funds that can pay back any loans that they want. We haven't seen any issues raising money, both either internally or as part of the City of Columbus. In fact, we've seen banking and financial institutions reach out to us and say, how can we be involved and what part can we play? So that's probably a long-winded way of saying there may be different mechanisms, but I think getting public agencies to stand beside you as you go to a financial institution is a way that could alleviate that concern.
All right, thank you. We have another question from Audrey who asks, it's a bit more technical, between a DC microgrid and an AC microgrid, which is the most suitable for a future city?
So that's a great question again. The pilot we're doing is an AC microgrid. It's simpler, it's easier, it's more cost effective. We work with the Electric Power Research Institute. We really do think as microgrids scale, and as Audrey asked, DC microgrids will be a component of our offering. Right now, we just wanted to get the microgrid and the regulatory construct around that, but we do think over time, we'll make more partnerships and we will pilot with a DC microgrid and a customer that wants to implement a DC microgrid. I would use this opportunity also to say, today's charging for buses, vehicles, what have you, is all wired. We think over time that'll become wireless. You'll have inductive plate, inductive charging. So we think if you look at technology roadmaps, you take a stand today, you implement it, you scale it to a certain extent. But we really think the way technology continually evolves, those models get disrupted by new models, but that shouldn't stop you from trying something today with an eye to the future.
That's perfect. We have one more question. Okay, another question. Is it possible to use your model for a more rural area?
And so that's a great, and and I said that right in the beginning, I used to say smart city and then I changed it to smart communities because I was asked that question here too. And our CEO is very insistent, this shouldn't be a Columbus only thing. This should apply everywhere. And I think, and I believe it can be. Not everything, because some of what I talked about does require scale, but many of these technologies are driven by the same technology that drove the smartphone revolution. They become so low cost, so easy to deploy, they do require reliable electric infrastructure and reliable telecom infrastructure. So if that rural community doesn't have, in the United States, nearly, I would say everywhere has electric supply. The level of reliability varies a little bit, but not much. Telecom sometimes is spotty in the rural communities, so that you'd have to address that issue. But if you have those two, many, if not all of these smart city technologies, pilots, partnerships can be translated over to a rural community and should be translated. And we have a digital divide between urban and rural here. We don't want to have a smart divide between urban and rural. And that's where we believe the utility plays an integral part of providing universal access to all customers and citizens of its service territory.
All right, thank you so much. Being conscious of your time, of all participants and of the presenters, I think we'll wrap that up for today. If you have any outstanding questions, you can send them to communications@globalelectricity.org, and I will send that email in the chat, so you will have a written copy of that address. On behalf of the Global Sustainable Electricity Partnership, I'd like to thank Ram for your very insightful presentation, and also to all the attendees who came today to our webinar. We hope that you enjoyed it and learned something new. A recording of the webinar will be available on our website, www.globalelectricity.org, within the next week. Thank you again, everyone, for joining, and we hope you have a very good morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are. Thank you very much.